4.
A 4. Chris, the topic we will be discussing today is how do you maintain momentum for a game when there are long gaps between game sessions? Chris, this is so relevant to my life right now. I look forward to talking about this.
Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rao.
Andy, the weather has finally turned in Michigan. It is officially fall outside.
Yes.
I see that you're wearing a flannel. I'm in a hoodie. For me, this is the most comforting time of year.
Yes, I love this time of year. I feel like I can get excited about Halloween now. I was not able to while it was like 89 degrees like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
But now that it's very fall-like outside and there's leaves falling down and it's kind of crisp but not cold, it's wonderful.
Yeah. I'm sure I ask you this every year, probably even on air, but do you go all out? Do you do Halloween decorations?
I'm not a big decorations person. I'm bad at any sort of like, I'm bad at any sort of like house maintenance or like presentation related task.
Okay.
So whether it's like hanging up Christmas lights or putting up Halloween decorations, I tend towards what's something really minimal that I can hang on like the hook that's already on my door.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So you're not out there like constructing some sort of gigantic, like scary spider in the tree.
No, I did take my young son. We strolled through a Spirit Halloween store.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I marveled at those incredibly tacky, but just wonderful, like, yard, what are they, installations or whatever, where you like get near it and a ghost like pops out and shrieks at it. Unmanageable volume. Yeah. If I had a budget of like $1,000, I would go crazy with these sorts of tacky installations. But
yeah, there's something really fun about that. So my son is 3 years old, and we were walking through like Home Depot or something last week, and like some of those decorations are just legitimately terrifying now. I feel like when I was growing up, like your options were like there was maybe one inflatable pumpkin that was available, and now it's like, well, do you want like a demon from hell to like arise from the ground and claw at you? Like, you got it, right? If you want. Yes. So I was like steering him around particular aisles to avoid that. Yeah. Okay, but we are very off track. Are you doing anything special are you doing a Halloween game at all?
So good question. I've thought about it. I kind of realized that Halloween had sort of snuck up on me. Normally I would run some sort of Halloween game, but I don't think I've given my players really enough notice time-wise to kind of pull something together. And so I think I'm probably... So the other thing is I'm running a weekly Call of Cthulhu game for my wife and teenager, and that's already kind of Halloween friendly. So I've actually been thinking, like, do I introduce something Halloween-ish into the game that comes nearest to Halloween, or do I switch? I mean, I'd be happy to I could run Alien, I could run something else for them that would be fun. So I guess it's up in the air. How about you?
I'm not planning anything in particular for Halloween, although the gaming group I play in is going to be meeting sort of around then as well. So I'm sure something Halloween-y will happen there. In Call of Cthulhu, well, I guess I don't know enough about the history of Halloween to know if costume parties were a big thing or not back in the Call of Cthulhu like in the 20s and stuff. I mean, could you very easily sort of be like, oh, and it's Halloween, so everybody's dressed up?
I think you could, I think a kind of decadent sort of Great Gatsby like costume extravaganza would be very much in genre for that. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, you could do that. Just a masquerade, I think, breaking out in a Call of Cthulhu game is right for lots of possible complications and various cultists showing up at places they should not be.
Yeah, and what percent of the partygoers are like not actually? Is it not actually a mask? That's like their actual. Face,
yes,
right?
Yeah, absolutely. You go to take the mask off, and there's nothing underneath.
Yeah,
yeah, that's good.
So I actually have a kind of related question about that. So the next big event in my Call of Cthulhu game is something I could use a little bit of help brainstorming, and it is actually a big party.
Ooh, okay.
So I'm just curious. We used to do this thing where we would make a like a D6 random table based on a random topic that we came up with. And I'm wondering, we don't actually maybe need to make a table, but I could use some help brainstorming things that could happen at a kind of over-the-top 1920s party.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I'll give you a little more context. So the PCs in this case, they basically want to steal some books from the private library of like a super rich 1920s personality.
Yeah. You said Call of Cthulhu, right? So it's like, of course they're stealing books. Yeah,
exactly. They're stealing books. So, and again, it's set in the 1920s in New York. And so this party is put on by like a wealthy businesswoman, and it's going to feature, I've been reading up on like what are some of the celebrities from the time that kind of show up here. So it's like a really high-end party where anyone could show up.
Mm-hmm.
And the PCs have gotten themselves kind of hired as temporary servants.
Yes.
To like, I guess carry drinks to the guests or whatever, just for this party. And that's of course a pretense to like break into the library and steal some books. But so I could use some help brainstorming, like what are some things I can throw at them, like encounters or experiences or something like that, I don't want to completely derail, their mission, but I want to complicate it with some like interesting and maybe funny experiences they can have as servants and maids at this party for the super rich, these super rich dilettantes and celebrities.
Yes. Oh, that is a fascinating question. So the very first thing that occurred to me is, do you know those? I'm sure you can. I'm sure they have an official name, but like those towers of glasses that you like pour champagne in the top and it like trickles down to all the other glasses. And I'm just thinking about like, if they have a strict time limit to try to go steal these books, but then they get corralled into having to set one of those up for the very first time. That could be pretty fun. You could have whoever's running the party be like, no, I want it taller, right? Taller than that. Taller.
Yeah. Okay.
Are there any of the characters who are like particularly good at something where they could either show off or they could be like, oh, I wish I was over there so I could help with it, but some other character has to do it.
So I think some of the inherent comedy in this is that the PCs have no skills that are related to like being a good servant or maid or like butler type person at a party. So any sort of like, I have to imagine something that would be routine for like a career servant will be a tense die roll for like this, learned anthropologist who's trying to pass themselves as a maid.
Oh, excellent. Yeah. I mean, you could do like just thinking like social encounter sort of things. Again, we're talking more like, roadblocks, not like, everybody's a cultist, right? Like those sorts of things. Yeah. I think, like complicated drink order or like, someone has an allergic reaction to something that,
that's a good one. Yes.
They're carrying around their hors d'oeuvres and like something has shellfish in it that they didn't know about. Like someone asked pointedly, does this have shellfish?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Kind of along those lines, maybe like a kind of an entitled celebrity has a really ludicrous request to make. Like whatever, my mistress is showing up at 7:45 and they can't, and my wife is showing up at 8:00 and you have to make sure that they never cross, see each other or cross paths or something.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. The same token, maybe that like the entitled celebrity like demands that a piano be brought out so they can perform.
Yes.
Yeah, ridiculous demands. I'm also thinking like 1920s, whether or not this is true or this is something that the like media has incepted into my brain. I feel like there was a lot of like emphasis on like like fire and like sparklers and stuff. So I could see there'd be like, people like trying to like, have some sort of like sparkler toast, right? So you've got like a bunch of people with like fire, basically fire sticks in the air. Are there any things that they have like glommed onto in the adventure that you could sort of reintroduce?
Ooh, yeah, good question. I mean, there's some kind of plot related stuff that would be tedious to go into the details of it right now. Like I could complicate things by having some of the guests be people they've maybe crossed paths with in the past and might recognize that they're not actually maids.
Yes. Yeah.
So I could think of a few people it will be really awkward if that person were to recognize them at the party, I think. And then that person would have the choice of exposing them and making a deal of it, or keeping it quiet and maybe getting some leverage somehow over the PCs.
Yeah. That would be really good. I mean, especially if they start rolling poorly, right? Introducing that's always a fun. I mean, just to borrow from like, Blades in the Dark, like, a consequence of rolling poorly, it gets much worse for you. Is there another faction of people that could also be there trying to get the books?
I hadn't. That seems like a very obvious question, but I hadn't really considered it. There are people who would want to get the books to keep the PCs from having them. So that is an interesting. That is an interesting possibility.
I don't know how you'd exactly pull it off, but it would be pretty funny if it turns out that every single one of the hired like maids and butlers and stuff were people from different factions. Like there's some sort of inciting event where like everybody pulls out the gun they've had hidden
under there. It would be amazing if the PCs got there and they realized that their fellow help were there at cross purposes to them, and like what do you do? Do you like do you sabotage the other team? Do you
because they need to work together enough to where they can all stay sort of in the space and not
they can't get fired and kicked out. It's like, so it's not a free-for-all like for the PCs.
That sounds like that's going to be a fun time. Do you have any other ideas you've been kicking around?
Well, I think it would be, my only other idea was just I'd like to sprinkle in a couple of maybe real world personalities from the time period. New York at the time had a really flamboyant or really news making mayor, so I want to have him make a showing, and maybe a famous musician or something like that. So I don't know. I think this group of PCs would involve some kind of getting into some kind of shenanigans with a historical figure. So
I wonder if you could have like Fitzgerald show up. Right.
Like,
you're throwing like a Great Gatsby style party, like have Fitzgerald there, who I don't think he was like famous, right? Quote unquote famous at that point. But I think you're right. The players themselves would get a kick out of seeing someone.
And that would be just as fun. Yeah. So I could justify in this party, the way I've set it up, I could justify almost anyone in the world like making an appearance. So anyway, this is really helpful. Thanks for helping me. I've got some. That's giving me some good food for thought. So
that'll be fun. You'll please report back how the party went. It was a disaster, I'm sure, but
I mean, it goes without saying it will be a total disaster, but I hope it'll be a really funny one that we can talk about in a few weeks. So
cool. All right. Well, let's maybe. Do you want to shift into our topic, or do you have anything else that you wanted to bring up?
I am fine shifting into our topic because it's been something that's been on my mind a lot lately. Our topic, and maybe you too, our topic is how you keep momentum going between sessions. And I guess in our last episode, I kind of talked about an actual game I had run. By the way, I heard from a player who listens to this podcast who is in that game who gave me the player kind of feed, the player side of that experience. That was a really fun.
Oh, that's great. Were they pointing out things that you had missed, or did they?
I don't think so. I think they were kind of just, I don't know. It's hard. I don't want to go too much into the details, but I would say it's useful. It's useful, I think, to just every now and then hear how the other side of the table is experiencing a game, whether it's the GM or the PCs. And I don't know. It was useful feedback to hear from the players. He confirmed that like I hadn't made clear enough. If you recall, kind of the central issue in last episode was, I presented something intended as a background unchangeable problem that the PCs interpreted as something that they could and were invited to solve. Mm-hmm. And he confirmed that, like, yeah, I did not communicate. The players did not get the message that this is a background thing. Don't try to solve it. It's just part of the adventure. So that was helpful. And I would like to try to avoid being in that specific situation again by just maybe planning a little bit better as a GM. But, it has made me kind of resolve that in the future, if there are things that I truly don't want the players to butt their heads against or spend time solving, I'm just going to make it really over the top clear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good to get that feedback. Yeah, I think that's one thing as GMs. I think it can be a little bit hard to ask for that. That sort of feedback, and you also don't want to like rehash everything from a session, right? Because it's not super useful, but it also is like a really good thing. I mean, I think the framework we've talked about and we've used, I think even on the podcast of the Stars and Wishes is really, really helpful in that regard, just to get kind of like immediate feedback of like, hey, what did you like and what did you want to see more of? Yep. More of in a session. Like that's super useful feedback, right? And to be clear, you're not asking for like, how did I screw up, right? Like that's, how did I screw up? Like, like what went wrong, right? Like I think that's a different conversation, and honestly, probably not that super useful to have with your friends about a game. But I was
going to say it is kind of interestingly hard to kind of get real feedback about how a game went. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but I very rarely had productive conversations with players where I was like, how did that go? What did you guys think?
Yeah. Like almost never. Yeah.
Yeah. Like no one is going to say anything really meaty or critical in that context. And it's kind of funny. The way I got my really good feedback from this thing was to like go through, was to like podcast about it.
Yes.
And then, hear about it like a very indirect way. You would have thought I could have like emailed the players and said, hey guys, I enjoyed this last session, but I had these challenges. What do you guys think? I don't really think anyone would have replied to that with like,
no,
very great feedback.
Yeah, I think it's hard, right? So I mean, not everybody should have a podcast in order to like indirectly talk to their friends, right? That's not not a great thing. But I mean, it's a nice side benefit, I guess, if you want to start a podcast. But yeah, I mean, I think like part of the like the conversations that we have on this are like, we're trying to do that with each other, right? Of like, oh, like what did all this mean, right? Like, how could we have done better? Like what worked, all that sort of stuff. So I think like putting that out there, right? And then, I mean, you are lucky in that one of your players listened to it and took the time to respond to like, so that's pretty cool. But like, I think the ask of like the email afterwards is very different from and then I also had a 40-minute conversation on air with someone else about it, right? Like there's a bit more to react to there, I think. Cause you're also sort of taking time to think through those thoughts and like maybe, think through those thoughts and present them in a way that I think is a little bit better. Like for me, it's really easy to ignore an email. Honestly, that's just where I'm at in life. But yeah, something like this where it's like, it can feel a bit more like a back and forth. Like that's where you're going to get better feedback.
Years ago, I had this system where at the end of the game, I would ask people to like basically praise, give a token or whatever it was, to somebody else at the table who had done something cool or had made, who had made everyone laugh or had just contributed in a great way to the game. And like the intent was to like gather a little bit of feedback to kind of encourage positivity among the players. And I still remember the day the players approached me, they're like, we feel really uncomfortable doing this and we'd like to not do this, because of that. When you praise someone, are you kind of, are you indirectly saying that somebody else didn't contribute to the game, that sort of thing? So I think it's funny for a social event. This is a hobby that is like actually a little difficult to have like these sort of kind of unemotional, kind of clear-minded, let's let's talk about how that went and
Mm-hmm.
what can we learn from it type of conversations.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's, if you're playing a board game, it can be easier, I think, because then you can like sort of attack the mechanics and be like,
Yeah.
oh, I like that mechanic. I didn't like this mechanic. It was fun when you use them in this way, right? Like, so you can kind of like, there is that remove, but like when you are talking about games where there is an amount of like, I don't know, performance and you're putting yourself into it and all that, I think, it can get tricky to offer like, good feedback. It makes me wonder what, like, the professional actual play podcasts, people, like, how do they talk about their sessions with each other?
Yeah.
Like when you sort of have to be producing a product, right? Like that's a very different mentality to like, sitting around with your friends. And it's like, like, I think we all want to, be better people, right? Is like, I think a general thing, but like, do you really need to do that with a game, like a game that you're playing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'd be interested if anyone listening has kind of has figured out a way to have these conversations, or has decided that they don't want to have these kind of conversations with the other people at the table. I'd be kind of interested to hear what other people do or how they approach this.
Yeah, this is to me, this is interesting because I think it does sort of connect in with the topic, that we're talking about maintaining momentum. And I think part of like maintaining momentum is, well, a huge part of it, right, is like remembering what happened previously. And like sometimes like these acts of like asking for feedback that can solidify those memories of like what the session was, when you kind of restate like, oh, I really like this thing. I think you're more likely to remember that.
Yeah.
Remember that later going to the next session. So I know that like you take some time after sessions and record like a little voice memo to yourself. Are you still doing that?
I do. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's super useful.
Yeah. And then do your, I mean, it's a super useful trick. So you just like, you take a couple minutes and kind of do a recap, and then you can either listen to it at the table or listen to it ahead of time by yourself. I'm wondering, do your players also take notes themselves?
So I guess I'll talk now about my kind of weekly Call of Cthulhu game with family members. Yeah, they take exhaustive notes during sessions. But that's a weekly game. It's not too hard. Stuff has not really had time to slip out of memory, especially if we just take a quick minute to recap at the beginning of each new game.
Yeah.
So I found weekly is, if you are gaming weekly, that's a pretty fine pace for like keeping everybody remembering what's going on, and not just remembering what's going on, but kind of being able to tap into the emotions or the momentum of what was happening the last time we met, that to me is as much a challenge as the factually remembering where did we leave off. I just to go personal here. So in the last month or two, I tried to get a game, like a twice monthly game of Curse of Strahd going. And I heard back from my players that really more than once a month for this group of players was not feasible schedule wise. And so I said, then let's not do Curse of Strahd. Let's stop. And it was simply because, I mean, I would love to play D&D with these people at any pace, but a month is a long time. Is a long time, and it's actually less the facts of what happened and more the, can we just keep the spirit? Can we get back into the spirit we were all in at the end of the last session, when you were really angry at the bad guy or really motivated to do this, or feeling frustrated or sad about some plot development? Can we get back into that? 4 weeks later, that's a pretty tough ask.
Yeah, it is. The game that I'm playing in right now, we meet up, it's about once a month, and that is tricky, right? Like it's very tricky to kind of get back into that mental and emotional space every time that we meet. I feel like we've been somewhat on that schedule for a while now, so I think we've developed some ways to do that. I mean, I think part of it, right, like we all are sitting there taking notes all the time too. So when we sit down to do that recap, we can kind of like piece together like, oh yeah, this is what was happening, like in play. I think we'd all rather be doing it weekly, right? Or every other week like that. It's just so hard to pull off with a bunch of adults, especially with my schedule. But, yeah.
Does your GM do anything in that month between games? Do either you, the players, or do the GM? Do you guys talk about the game? Does the GM move things along at all in between sessions, or is it just like radio silence and then a month later you meet?
Yeah, pretty much radio silence. Okay. Yeah, I don't know why that is necessarily. Like, I mean, I think just the group is not the sort of group that's going to like all get into a Discord together and be chatting all the time about other stuff. Yeah, like there's a text thread that we use to like check in to make sure that we're all still playing on the day. Yeah, but I mean, I think like we're still thinking about it, right? So like I might have mentioned this last time, but like the main plot point that we sort of all glommed onto was that there is a 5-legged albino monkey that was running around that we had to go, I mean, it's just like you introduce that sort of thing into a game and that becomes everybody's sole focus, right? So despite like all these other like, giant world changing things going on around us, we all sort of knew going into that session, like this is our goal. Like we need to go track down that monkey and get it and have it, join our party. Right. Which we were successful. That's great. But like I think like, like when you're thinking about you're right on, like there's a factual level of maintaining momentum of just like what's everybody's character name, right? Like down to that all the way to like, who are the villains? What are they up to? All that sort of stuff. But then, the emotional side of it, I do find is a little bit hard. I don't think we generally don't end in the middle of a conflict. Matt, our GM, is pretty good about stopping us before we dive into something kind of like meaty to dive into. But I've certainly played in games where you, for whatever reason, have to stop in the middle of combat. And like that can be hard to get back going, even if it's only a week later.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, that was one of the other reasons I said, well, maybe like let's wait and figure this out. And because in D&D I would say the likelihood that you're going to end a session with an unresolved combat is higher than in a lot of other systems. And and you can take a photo of where everything was on the battle map, but that it's just not, that's an extra little speed bump. So do you as player, so you have this monthly game, you really enjoy it. I've heard a lot about it here on the podcast that you shared. It sounds amazing. Do you as player, do you do what kind of thinking do you do about that game in the time between sessions? And do you think that thinking makes a difference in what your experience is when the game day arrives and the game starts?
That's a good question. I probably don't do as much thinking as I would like to. Like, I'd love to be the sort of person that sits down and really sketches out like who my character is, their backstory, like motivations, all that sort of stuff. And I'm not that person right now. Like I can't be that sort of player at the moment. Like I tend to sort of figure out who the character is at the table, which probably means a lot of my characters end up being a little bit the same, but I think that's sort of okay. Okay too. But yeah, I mean, I think the things that I think through are really like where my characters, like how their reactions are going to be to certain things. So if like I'm thinking through, like we know we're going to go get that monkey, is my character going to like want to steal the monkey, kill the monkey, befriend the monkey, like, right, like those sorts of things, right? Like thinking through a little bit of the motivations ahead of time, so I'm not caught off guard with like how would I react in this situation? Although I will ask myself those questions too. But yeah, I mean, I think there's that, like there's some element of like reading over the character sheet again, right, just to remember what's going on. I think it's a little bit less important in this game. I think, you're talking about D&D, I think it becomes more important to do a little bit of that legwork ahead of time of like remembering what spells you have, what they do, what equipment you might have, sort of being able to hit the ground running with like the questions you have for your GM of like, I want to switch these things up or sell this thing, buy this thing. That sort of stuff is like, it takes you maybe 10 minutes beforehand. But then if everybody's blowing 10 minutes in the session to sort of like get back into character and figure out what's going on again. Like that can
Yeah.
be a big chunk of your game night if you haven't
Yep.
taken a little bit of time to do that beforehand.
I've had some good luck in my weekly Call of Cthulhu game. Again, a weekly game makes this pretty easy, and I have the extra advantage that my players are in the same house, so they can meet in the kitchen and talk about it. But I try to end each game, telling them something they need to have decided by the time we meet again. So I'm helped by the structure of Call of Cthulhu, in which there's a lot of clues and avenues, and really the course of the game is shaped by what leads they choose to follow. But I try to turn that into a little bit of an assignment, so when we start next time, you guys need to have talked to each other, and you need to have figured out where you're going to go, So, okay, you decided to follow up this lead and take the train to Miskatonic University. I try to encourage that decision to have been made before we start the game, instead of meeting and then starting that big PC planning discussion, which can, infamously go on forever. Where should we go next? So, if I could think of a good way to do that in like a kind of a D&D game reliably, I do think that giving a mild assignment, it's not like work. It's just like, give this a little bit of a thought, and maybe, it is a little work, but confer just enough to like, decide where you want to go before we meet. Don't wait until we meet and then figure it and then talk about it. That's been helpful in Call of Cthulhu, at least.
Yeah, and I can imagine too, just the act of having to make the decision in between sessions too, like that can help, keep momentum going as well. Because you're like, then you're sort of noodling on it rather than being like, I'll think about that next time. Like, next time we meet, like as I'm sitting down, right? You're like, oh yeah, this is the decision we made, and like you can come and present that as, here's where we're going next, rather than like, what were the options again? And then you're
right.
So I think that's super smart to do it that way. Yeah, give them a small homework assignment.
So do you have any suggestions though for running like let's say a pretty, tactically detailed game like D&D, but with just a long stretch of time in between games? Because obviously in my case, one solution is I can pitch a game that works better with big pauses in between. And there are games that work better for various reasons. But what if we want to do D&D? Are there some tricks that I can do as a GM that are going to make that more likely to be fun?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a lot of stuff that you've thought about, but just to sort of state it. I mean, the times where I've had like gaps in between sessions when I'm playing a tactical game like D&D, the really useful things are to like end on cliffhangers all the time. And I know I've talked about this a lot on the podcast. Like, yeah, like you don't want to end in the middle of the combat, but like, end right before combat starts, right? And then right. So those sorts of things, or, end after or just before something, well, usually before, like always try to end before something interesting happens, because then you can dive straight into just the action of the thing at the next session, which I think is generally the more exciting part. And even if that action is like, oh, you finally found, the shop that you really needed to find to sell all of your equipment, right? Like then you could sort of end before that, end before a battle starts. Because I think otherwise, right, you risk losing a lot of that momentum of like you mentioned, of placement, of, stakes and that sort of stuff. The other thing that I would say is like, it's like Curse of Strahd is, I agree with you. I think that would be a hard one to run with long gaps in between. So if you're running something else, like you should be comfortable with like the reality of the story that you're telling changing in between sessions. In that when you sit down at the next session and everybody sort of agrees that this fight doesn't actually matter, even though when you left off, it really mattered to everybody. Like that's okay, right? Like the story is the story. Don't make the story into something that you like your hopes and dreams from last time or from beforehand. I think you should be just as willing to sort of like, improv or sandbox or whatever verb you want to use, like, to change up what's happening in that moment based on what the players are feeling when they come back to the table that time.
Yeah, and maybe it's better just to recognize, like all of the enthusiasm for this fight has just dissipated in the last 4 weeks. Whatever, the fight's over.
Yeah,
you win. Like, let's move on. Like that, you know. TV, it's interesting. Like, TV shows do this. Do you remember a show called? It had Jennifer. It was a spy show, Alias. Do you remember that show?
Yes.
I used to laugh at this show because it would do a common trick, but it would just do it particularly blatantly, where like every episode would end on this incredible cliffhanger. You know, the bad guy was like pointing a gun in the hero's face, and there's just absolutely no way out. They were just trapped. How would do this? Great cliffhanger. The next episode would begin, and rather than be a really huge, exciting scene that would resolve that tense set piece that had been set up, the hero would, like, in 5 seconds, just, you know, knock the gun out of the way. And all of that, you know, the purpose of that tension it had filled its purpose, and there was no point in like turning this into a big scene. Its purpose was to keep you tense until the next episode, but you don't actually need to see them do a big drawn out fight. Like, just knock the gun out of the way. She's out of danger, you know, in 10 seconds. This, you know, and then we're on to what the real meat of this episode is. So I don't know. That's my brain is spinning on that a little bit. And I wonder, you know, I realize that in a game like D&D, you know, the fights are part of the fun. So you can't just do this willy-nilly. But I do wonder, you know, sometimes you could skip some of that like low signal to noise stuff in that manner, right?
Yeah.
Make a big deal of setting it up, establish the stakes or whatever like that. Really build it up. But then, you know, no one actually needs to spend an hour to get to the point of this tension. You know, let's just cut right to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about that. Yeah, it's the model of TV these days, right, is like making everything bingeable, right? Like, so I think you still have those cliffhangers at the end of episodes, but it doesn't need to be as big of a cliffhanger as it used to be, where it's like you needed 20 million people to watch that episode and then decide I need to watch the next one, right? So you're going to pull off every possible trick to do that, right? And your D&D games are not going to be bingeable in that, like, you can't just like like do one session after another like that, right? Because you'll die of exhaustion very quickly. But I mean, you know, by all means, steal every trick in the book that, you know, early 2000s TV had figured out by then of keeping the audience engaged.
I want to wrap us up because we've been going for a bit, but I wanted to say one more thing, that a thing I tried, I didn't commit to it enough to see if it would work, but it felt promising to me. During a kind of there was a gap between Star Trek games, and in that gap, I wanted my players not to completely check out of, you know, the Star Trek mood. So I asked over email in between sessions some like character building, but not really adventure affecting things, like the sort of stuff that we've talked about, like those character moments that you might spring during a travel montage or something like that, you know? So I think the question I asked was, I had a couple questions, and one of them was like, you know, what is the place on your ship that, like, you know, the crew all goes to hang out at, you know, what's the restaurant or the lounge or something like that? What is the place on your ship? And I had a few other questions like that I just want people to think a little bit, just put a little bit of thought into it. It's kind of fun. It doesn't affect the adventure. It's not really going to matter in any meaningful way, but it has added to kind of a collective, I guess, interest in or commitment to this kind of shared, you know, this shared dream of a game that we're doing. So if I could come up with, you know, a big list and just kind of piece those out during the low points in between those big gaps between sessions, I don't know. Especially in a game like D&D, where sometimes it is, you know, the tactical nature of it does make it a little hard to have those character moments. You know, tell me about a memory you had. Tell me about a time that you helped somebody else on the team. Tell me, you know, me what you really fear. That's stuff that maybe you could hash out outside of the game sessions. That
yeah, I think you're right on. And so the game I'm playing in, Matt does a really good job of asking like kind of those flavor questions in the moment of like, you know, like let's paint the scene together, right? Like it doesn't really matter for the plot some of the side stuff that's happening at the, you know, the giant festival that we're at. Like, so let's like what would be fun for you to have there. Right. And I think those things where you're sort of like, it's not right, but like ceding control to the players, right? Like letting the players sort of chime in with with what they want there. Like that's like, I mean, I think it's brilliant, right? Because then that's something they can remember really easily.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, let's wrap up here. Do you have any closing thoughts, or do you want to talk us out here?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. Yes. So this has been a good conversation. So we've been Roll for Topic. We were part of the Roll for It Media Podcasting Network. Our sister show, The Splat Book with John Corey and Kyle Latino, is wonderful. Kyle's Kickstarter just wrapped up. Kyle with the Cloud Curio folks just did a Kickstarter for Monstrous. It's sort of a like systemic agnostic monster manual, I guess is one way you could put it. It looks gorgeous. I'm super happy for them. They hit their goal.
Congratulations, guys.
Yeah, really looking forward to getting that in my hands as soon as I can. But yeah, I think that does it for us. So I've been Chris Salzman.
I've been Andy Rao.
Remember, if your player's having fun, you're a great GM.